Let's take a look at some types of deployments. Now, there are many different types of software deployments, but I like to break them into three general groups. One is the Big Bang. That means everything goes live all at once. Then we have a phased rollout, which is generally more gradual over time. Then we have something called parallel adoption. That means we're going to implement the new, while still using the old, and in some cases it may require duplicate data entry to keep both systems up and running. Now all these methods have different trade-offs. The Big Bang is the riskiest of course, but it's gonna give you the shortest amount of time for an implementation. A phased rollout has lower risk, but it's gonna take some time. Now a parallel adoption is gonna take the most amount of time, and I'm not gonna say that it has the least amount of risk, because you're actually trying to maintain two systems, and one of the most difficult things in a software rollout, or a software deployment, is trying to keep your underlying data in sync if you're doing a parallel adoption. And so there is still a significant degree of risk there, it's just placed in a different place in the project. Specifically, we're going to look at some phased rollout types that we can do with AWS. First, we have something called rolling deployment. Now, let's say for example we have an application load balancer, we have an auto-scaling group, and we have a fleet of EC2 servers all running on version 1. What we can do is create a new launch configuration, because if you remember we can't edit existing launch configurations, we have to create new ones, so we would create a new launch configuration with an updated AMI. And then we'd start terminating the old EC2 instances, and when they come up they would come up under the new AMI. And eventually we would have all of our fleet updated to our version 2. Now another deployment we can use is using Route 53 to do something called A/B testing, or an A/B deployment. And this is very common in websites, where they want to test the new format, or the new layout of a website, with a small percentage of people, and see if that increases conversion rate, for example. So in this case we can use Route 53, and we can send 90% of the traffic to one version, and a smaller, maybe 10%, to the new version. And then over time we can shift that percentage to ultimately, we're serving 100% of the traffic to version 2, and 0% to version 1. And there's also something called a Canary Release, and the reason they call it a Canary Release is way back when people were mining underground, sometimes the caves would fill with hazardous gas. And one of the practices of the time was they would bring a little canary in a cage down, and if the canary died, they knew that the gas was rising, high enough to affect humans, so everybody would have to get out. And so, it's kinda similar situation. Here, we would deploy a version 2 in production, and just sit back and wait and see if we had any errors, and if a given time passed, and we didn't have any errors, then we would go ahead and deploy the new version to the other parts of the landscape. Now there's also something called the blue-green deployment. And in this case we have two load balancers, and we have an auto-scaling group that's already running with version 1. We can create a new load balancer, and behind that we'll put an auto-scaling group that's running version 2 of our application. Then at some point in time we decide to switch over, usually at the Route 53 level, but there's multiple ways we can do this, but we would switch over to the new version. And then if we had problems, then it's just a matter of simply switching back to the current version through Route 53 configuration. Now the real benefit of a blue-green deployment is that you shouldn't have to make changes to your application after it's deployed. You should just switch it to another version, and you can do that indefinitely, switching back and forth every time you revise your application. What that allows is a very easy rollback if you happen to see there's problems when you release your application. Now there are a few different ways we can accommodate blue-green deployments on AWS. First is with a DNS, and as you saw earlier, we used Route 53 to just point to a new ELB, or maybe we're going directly to an EC2 instance. We can also swap out the auto-scaling group that's already loaded up with the new versions of the application. We can also change the auto-scaling group launch configuration to use the new AMI versions. Now just remember, you can't change your launch configuration once it's been created, so you would really create a new one, and then assign that to the ELB. And if we are using Elastic Beanstalk, there's a feature on Beanstalk that allows us to swap the front URL to point to a different stack that's running our new version. And we can also clone the stack using OpsWorks. And similarly, we can just change the DNS to point to the new stack once it's up and running. There are some situations where blue-green deployments just really aren't recommended. Here we are calling them contraindications. It's another big word that sometimes architects like to use. It just means anti-patterns, or situations that may not be candidates for blue-green deployment. One of those situations is if your code is very tightly coupled with your data store schema. For blue-green deployments to be very handy, you want to deploy those independently of your data layer. But if your code is tightly coupled, or you're making a schema change during that upgrade process, then it could cause problems. Best practice here is to make sure your schema changes are both forward and backward compatible in the case that you have to roll back, so you're not struggling to undo those schema changes on your data store. Some applications require special upgrade routines, and this is pretty common in like ERP systems, or very complex software. When they do an upgrade, sometimes they have to run post-processing programs to change some internals of how the data is stored, or how the program works. These types of things aren't very conducive to blue-green deployments, because the rollback is not just as simple as repointing a DNS entry, for example. And some off-the-shelf products just might not be blue-green friendly, so keep in mind that may be a possibility as well.